We get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our career webinar. My name is Michelle Rapp, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Strategy in the Office of Alumni Relations. I organize the career programs for alums. And the idea for this program came about because as I was doing some coaching with alumni, several people referred to imposter syndrome, and I definitely had people expressing confidence issues at work and in their job search. So I said it was time to bring in an expert. So I'm delighted to have Kim Meninger here with us to give us a lot of ways of thinking about and working with this issue. As a certified executive and leadership development coach, Kim Meninger empowers individuals and organizations to reach their full leadership potential. Kim has coached hundreds of clients and has presented on career advancement and leadership topics to corporate, nonprofit, and academic audiences. She's especially passionate about helping women leaders to develop their confidence, visibility, and influence in order to maximize their impact and advance their careers. Kim has a BA in psychology and an MBA from Boston College. She is a certified ICF Associate Certified Coach and CCE Board Certified Coach. And her certifications are in career, executive, and leadership development coaching. She also has a certificate in executive leadership from Cornell University. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm really grateful to be here, and thank you all for being part of this conversation today. And I really do want it to, as much as possible, feel like a conversation. Unfortunately, we can't be, be together in one room, but there will be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions and to share your own insights in the comments. So please feel free to do so at any time. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation. And this might sound a little bit strange to say, but this whole topic of imposter syndrome is actually my favorite topic to discuss. I have my own personal journey with imposter syndrome. The first time I was ever introduced to the concept, I was a college student studying psychology. And when I heard the term, I remember my first thought being like, oh, thank God, there's a name for this, right? It's not just me. And then I experienced it on and off throughout my corporate career. I spent roughly half of my career in the high-tech industry as a psych major who didn't have a technology background, so imposter syndrome reared its ugly head a number of times throughout that journey. And then, as a coach, I've certainly encountered it many times in the people that I support. So from my perspective, it's really important for us to have this conversation as a means of normalizing the experience, letting you know that if this is something that you have felt at one time, maybe feeling right now, that you are not alone, that this is a pretty universal phenomenon. And also, my goal is to give you some very specific actionable steps and strategies that you can use if and when you do encounter imposter syndrome. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for one moment here. And what I'd like to start off by doing is to share some statements with you. And I want to ask you to each reflect on your own about whether these statements resonate in some way, either today, maybe you're feeling that way at this very moment, or maybe you have felt this way at some point throughout your life or your career. So here we go. Number one, I attribute my success to timing, I'm trying to move this out of the way. Okay, to timing rather than my own skills and talents. I worry that others will find out that I'm not as competent or capable as they think I am. I've unknowingly deceived people into thinking I'm good enough for this job. I feel undeserving of my success. At any moment, I may be exposed as a fraud. So those were certainly feelings that I had and continue to have from time to time. The thing about imposter syndrome is there isn't necessarily a cure, right? What we can do is better recognize it, better understand what triggers us, and be prepared to manage it more quickly and effectively than we have in the past. But as we'll talk about in a moment, it's not a syndrome in a medical sense. It's not a psychological condition. It's just really something that comes up for us typically at points of transition or times when we're stepping outside of our comfort zone. So if these statements do resonate with you, I want you to know that you're in very good company. If you were to Google imposter syndrome right now, you would find quotes from countless high-profile figures, celebrities, scientists, people from all different disciplines, people you'd probably least expect that have struggled with this. So I think it's helpful to know that we're not alone. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by imposter syndrome. How are we defining this? Imposter syndrome is a term that was initially coined back in the 1970s when two female psychologists started studying this. And they initially referred to it as the imposter phenomenon. It then evolved into imposter syndrome. And they used the term to describe those feelings of self-doubt and inadequacy that we might experience despite contradictory evidence. So on paper, to the outside world, we're successful, we're doing well, we seem well qualified and capable of doing what we're doing. But on the inside, there's that sense that I'm a fraud. At any moment, people are going to figure out that I don't actually know what I'm doing or belong here. What's interesting about imposter syndrome is that it's most common among high achievers. So as I mentioned before, it's the people you would least expect to struggle with it. But when you peel it back a bit, it actually makes sense because high achievers are the ones that are usually pushing the limits of their comfort zone. So it's unlikely that you will experience imposter syndrome if you're not challenging yourself in new ways. If you've been doing the same kind of work year in and year out, and you've essentially mastered your craft, there isn't a whole lot that's going to trigger imposter syndrome because you're comfortable. You know the ins and outs, and there's probably very little that surprises you. But for those of us who are high achievers, we always want to challenge ourselves to learn more and to do more. And each step of the way, we're likely to encounter that little voice or that nagging feeling that says, are you sure about this? Right? Not so sure that you're ready for this, which, as it says here, right, is it commonly occurs at transition points. And, again, for high achievers, usually over a period of time, we get really good at what we're doing. So we master something, we maybe become the go-to resource within our organizations or our teams. People depend on us. And so we're used to feeling in some ways like a rock star, right? And then we step into new territory, and that contrast can be really stark. That sense of, oh my goodness, I'm stepping out of a role or an experience where I'm used to being at the top of my game. And now suddenly I'm the new kid again. And I've got all of this new terrain to navigate. And we're so aware of what we don't know, right? And that's where imposter syndrome comes in. Interestingly, as I mentioned, these two female psychologists who did the initial research on imposter syndrome thought that it was a purely female phenomenon, that all of the early studies were done exclusively with women. It wasn't until relatively recently that the research expanded and it was determined that everybody struggles with imposter syndrome, or has the potential to struggle with imposter syndrome, I should say. Studies show that about 70% of the population will experience this at one point or another in their lives. So what does it look like? I want to take a moment to just kind of describe some of the characteristics or features of imposter syndrome. And some of these you might recognize. There's a self-doubt or a hesitation, and this can show up in different ways. Maybe there's a hesitation to raise your hand for something new because you're second guessing yourself and saying, I'm not really sure that I have all of the qualifications yet. I'm not ready. I see this a lot with the clients that I work with. I was just having a conversation with one of my female clients earlier last week who was telling me, my manager and my leadership team keep asking me, do you want to manage people? And my response is, I'm not sure that I know enough, right? I need to do this first. I need to do that first. And You might say that in some ways that's pragmatic. We certainly want to be prepared for the roles that we step into, but oftentimes those things that we tell us we need to know before we can do something are really expressions of self-doubt. It's a sense that, that imposter syndrome is kicking in. I don't necessarily feel like I'm ready or qualified. There may be an unwillingness to speak up or share your ideas. This is something I see all the time. People go into meetings, they go into conversations with their team, and in their head, they have this voice that's telling them, no, you can't say that. That's going to sound stupid. Or if that was a legitimate question, somebody else would have asked it already. Or if this is a good idea, we would have already heard it from somebody. This inner sort of narrative that's telling us that we're not ready for what we're trying to do. There's often the reluctance to take risks, right? Being bold, doing something that's outside of the box requires a certain amount of self-trust. And so if you want to challenge the system in some way, if you want to disagree with somebody else, it has to start from a place of, I trust that I belong in this room. I trust that I have value to offer. And oftentimes there's a disconnect there when we experience imposter syndrome. Perfectionism is one of the hallmarks of imposter syndrome. And what's interesting about perfectionism is that it consumes so much of our energy and often doesn't come with a high reward. So those of us who identify as perfectionists may apply the same perfectionistic tendencies across the board, even to things that are good enough, and where good enough is good enough. So we may spend a lot of time agonizing over the specifics of one email, or making sure that every PowerPoint slide that we put together is perfect, when in actuality, there really is no need for that level of due diligence. And what is unfortunately true is that there is no such thing as perfectionism, right? Or perfection, right? So we set this very unrealistic standard for ourselves that sets us up to fail because we can never, in actuality, meet it. And then what you'll often see too in leaders who struggle with imposter syndrome is micromanagement. Because once again, if we don't trust ourselves, right, it's hard for us to trust the people on our teams. We're worried about, am I doing this right? Or I'm not quite sure how to do the more strategic aspects of my job now that I've stepped into this leadership role. So I'm going to take comfort in some of the tactical work that is really familiar to me, that I know I do well. So in the process, I may be stepping on the toes of my team, or because I'm so worried that things aren't going to be perfect, I am obsessing over every little detail of what my team is working on. And that obviously can create a lot of issues around morale and motivation. So I want to stop there and just check in and see, are there any questions, any thoughts from anybody? Is this resonating with you?
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Gracia, and yeah, so many of these things are resonating, and I'm just kind of laughing about it. They just are so real, and the thing that you pointed out about like hesitating, like when sharing ideas, I find this to be constantly happening to me in this job that I'm at, because everybody is so qualified and so smart. And when you're saying like, oh yeah, if this was important, somebody else would have brought it up, I'm constantly thinking that, and then somebody brings it up, and then they'll literally say exactly what I was thinking, and then I'll kick myself for it, and it's just like this vicious cycle. So anyway, yeah, those are my comments.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And you are absolutely not alone. A quick trick I'll share that I often recommend to people who describe very similarly what you're talking about, is that sense of kicking ourselves for not speaking up, is to very subtly, when you're in a meeting, keep tally marks of all the times that you wanted to say something and didn't, and someone else said it and was congratulated or praised for it, right? What you're going to find is that pretty quickly that list of tally marks visually starts to accumulate, and it can help you to recognize, you know what, I can trust myself. It's just hard because
Yeah, that's a good one.
each individual scenario feels so new to us that we're not tying it to the past. We're not necessarily in that moment when we're feeling anxiety and worrying that we're going to get this wrong. We're not thinking about all the times in the past when we took a risk and it worked out well.
That makes sense.
Great.
We're seeing a lot of people saying that what you're saying resonates.
Oh, wonderful. Great. I'm glad to hear that. Not that I want anybody else to experience this, but I'm glad to know that the conversation is relevant and that you're identifying with what I'm talking about right now. We're going to talk a little bit about why imposter syndrome matters, which may seem like a funny question, but I think it's important to emphasize why it's so important to have the conversation. And it's a conversation that in my mind isn't happening enough. It's oftentimes perceived as either a personal issue that we need to take care of on our own or something fluffy. It's hard when we talk about concepts like confidence, imposter syndrome. They're not easy to quantify. And so when we're talking about a business environment, we tend to focus on the things that we can measure more effectively. And so oftentimes imposter syndrome falls by the wayside. It can be a sensitive topic. I was mentioning to Michelle and Katie before we jumped on here too, how in the past I've actually had people ask me to change the title of this presentation because they're worried that people won't show up because of stigma attached to imposter syndrome. And for me, my personal mission is to destigmatize this. There is no reason for any of us to experience shame or guilt or any feelings of negativity around this experience. It just is. It's just part of being human. And as soon as we own that and are more comfortable saying it out loud and talking with each other, we can get access to the support that we need. We're going to feel so much stronger. So here are my thoughts on why it's important for us to talk about this. Individually, as you might have imagined or as you may have experienced, when you're in a state of chronic self-doubt, when you're questioning, can I do this job? Am I going to be found out? What's going to happen? That comes with a lot of physical and emotional stress. We talked about perfectionism. You may be spending a lot of your extra time losing sleep, foregoing exercise or eating right so that you can overly perfect a particular work product, right? You may be experiencing all kinds of emotional stress. Anxiety is one of the classic ones of imposter syndrome, right? Because our mind is always distracted by this sense of, oh no, do I really belong here? We may not build adequate professional relationships to get the support that we need or to achieve our goals. Because once again, we have to trust when we're reaching out to build strategic relationships with the people around us that we have something that's of value to bring to that dynamic. And so oftentimes what I see in the people that I work with is this constant questioning of, I'd really like to better connect with my manager's manager or more senior people within the organization, but why would they want to take time out of their busy day to talk to me? What value do I have to bring? Right? So there's always this sense that I don't really belong here. Reduced professional satisfaction and motivation. How can you feel good about what you're doing? How can you feel that sense of fulfillment, that sense of satisfaction when you're feeling like you're one question away from everything crashing down, right? And then of course there's the risk of not reaching your full potential, because if you hesitate, if you're not willing to take risks, if you're always feeling like there's just one more thing I have to check off the list before I'm ready for this next step, you may not grow. You may start to plateau. Now, organizationally, imagine the impact on your organization when a critical mass of people is all feeling this way, right? When we talk about things like the physical and emotional stress, that could come with higher healthcare costs. It's certainly going to come with decreased productivity. And in industries that are reliant on knowledge workers, imagine the hit to your creativity and innovation when people are afraid to share a new idea because they're worried that they're going to sound stupid, right? Or they don't want to challenge an idea, or they don't want to step outside of the box because they're worried that there's going to be some penalty for doing that, right? This the major industries of our current economy depend on people's willingness and comfort to speak up and to try to create changes to the way that we've always done things. And you're going to have a smaller talent pipeline because you're not going to have people that are actively raising their hands and saying, I'm ready for the next step. So where does this come from? I think it's helpful to take a moment to think about, how did we get here? Why do those of us who experience imposter syndrome experience it? And it really starts early with messaging and experiences that we have with our early caregivers. So primarily for many of us, that's our parents. And there are usually two scenarios that tend to lead to imposter syndrome, and I'll share them with you. The first is the scenario in which the parent is overly effusive in their praise of the child. They say, oh, you are so wonderful. You're such a genius. You're so smart. They essentially give the message to the child that the child can do no wrong. And then the child steps out into the world and may start to get some more constructive criticism from coaches, teachers, other influential figures in their lives. And it's hard to reconcile that. And it plants this seed of doubt that continues to grow over time. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have parents that either by choice, because they don't want to overinflate their children's egos, or simply, neglect of some sort. They're not praising consistently their children's behaviors. Those children go out into the world and feel like they're never good enough. Nothing I do is ever good. So we've all heard the cliche of parents saying, why didn't you get an A+ instead of an A, right? These are the parents that we're talking about. And so you might be thinking to yourself, as I was when I was starting to study this, what does that mean if I'm a parent? How do I avoid creating imposter syndrome in my own children? And what I have found to be a really helpful way to think about this is the idea of the growth mindset. So some of you may be familiar with Carol Dweck's work around a growth versus a fixed mindset. So in a fixed mindset, we have this belief that I'm born with all of my capabilities. There's nothing I can really do about that. Nothing I do is going to change the outcome. So for example, if I say to myself, I'm just not good at math, doesn't matter if I try harder, there's no point in my doing anything with math because I'm just not good at math. Whereas if I have a growth mindset, I would adopt a view that says, I'm not good at math yet, right? But I have the potential to be good at math if I choose to invest in it. So maybe I'll take, a course with a different professor, or I will get some tutoring, or I'll do some practice tests and exercises to try to grow in that area, right? And so when we're trying to create a growth mindset in our children, which will help us to manage this overall experience with imposter syndrome, what can be helpful is to not praise the outcome, but the effort. So instead of saying, oh, that's so great that you got an A on your test, to say, wow, you worked really hard on that. It's great that you took that time to study and look at how it paid off. Because when you're a child, you really want to please your parents. And so if you feel like your parents just want you to get an A, you're less likely to take risks. You're less likely to do something that doesn't feel is going to guarantee the outcome that you want. And so it's similar to us as adults, right? And I think about this a lot when I think about just the language that we use to describe ourselves. We often use fixed language without realizing it. It's like, oh, I can't do that. A tip for this is truly to add the word yet to the end of that sentence, right? I can't do that yet. I wasn't born walking. I wasn't born talking. I wasn't born with any of the skills and capabilities that I have today. I acquired them over time. And the same thing is true of anything else that you don't know right now. You have a choice. You can decide, you know what? I don't know that yet, and I'm not interested in knowing it. I'd rather partner with people who have that expertise so that I can focus on the things that I really enjoy doing. Or, you know what? That seems to be something interesting or of potential value, so I'm going to invest in it. And with time, I will get more comfortable with it, just as I have with everything else that I've learned in my lifetime. When I think about the growth mindset, I often think about my own young children. I'm the mother of 2 young boys, and I think about watching them learn to walk and how often they would fall and get up and dust themselves off and try again. And I think, imagine if we were born with a fixed mindset, right? Imagine we get to the point where like, I just can't do this. I'm just not going to walk. It's just not for me. So this is something that, you know, we adapt to over time. If we start to think about ourselves as having overcome so many challenges already just to get to where we are, we realize, you know what, any new challenge that lies ahead isn't brand new. It's just an extension of all of the challenges that we've already had. And I'm resourceful enough to be able to figure it out. It's also more likely that you will experience imposter syndrome if you're the first in your family to do something. So if you're the first in your family to go to college, if you're the first in your family to move into a certain industry or a certain domain, it can be a little bit more challenging. You might feel a bit like an outsider. You know, if you grew up in a family of lawyers and then you go on to law school, that's going to feel more comfortable to you. You probably grew up in a household where you were, you know, hearing legalese and you were marinating in that culture. And so it feels more natural to you when you step into that world. Whereas if you've, let's say, never gone to college before, and now no one in your family's ever gone to college before, and now you're in this whole new world surrounded by people who seem so much more comfortable. You know, maybe their parents went to the same school, everybody's feels at home, and here I am so aware of how different my experience is. Deciding to pursue a different path can also be a trigger of imposter syndrome. So I see this a lot with people with non-traditional career paths. There's almost this sense that if I choose, and, you know, especially if I have some type of expertise or additional education in a certain area, and then I choose to walk away from that I'm disappointing someone. I'm disappointing myself. I'm disappointing perhaps my family, society. Let's say I spent years in medical school and decided I don't want to be a doctor anymore, right? There's that sense of I'm not doing what I was supposed to do. And now as you step into a new career path, let's say everybody in that same role or in that same space has taken a different, more traditional path, you may feel a sense of illegitimacy, or I lack the credibility that other people have because they've all gone in this linear direction and I didn't. So that means that my experience is somehow less than theirs. And then finally, the pressure to represent your group. So when you are an only or one of few, maybe you're the only woman in a male-dominated team, you're the only person of color in the room. If you feel different, I mean, and it can be anything, we can slice and dice this in many ways. If you're the only introvert on a team of extroverts, you're going to feel a sense of, I don't belong here, right? There's something wrong with me. And when it comes to more demographic-based differences, like being female, like being a person of color, you may even feel the added pressure of having to represent your whole group. So if I get this wrong, I'm not just letting myself down, I'm letting all women down, right? Maybe they'll never hire another woman again into this role, or maybe they'll never hire another person of color if I don't do a good job in this role. And that comes with a lot of pressure. So I want to stop here and just, I'm seeing some activity in the chat and want to just check in and see if anyone has any additional questions or insights that you'd like to share. I will share just personal. Oh, Bertrand.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I thank you so much for this. My name is Bert. I'm in Seattle, Washington, 2014, class of Northeastern. I'm starting my own business right now. It's a very lonely journey. I've taken the wrong, or I've made the decision to do it alone. And you know, every day I think about whether or not I want to bring in a co-founder or stuff. But I'm just wondering, based on your experience, how you've sort of managed, you know, perhaps people who are on that journey, that lonelier journey where there's not a lot of resources to kind of go left or right and say, hey, this is happening to me, right? You're inventing a new product, you're staring at this thing every day, and you don't know if it's going to work. You have this doubt that is almost continuous, right? So I'm just wondering, you've given a lot of examples around, hey, when you're in the setting of a group or maybe a bigger organization, but I'm just curious if you have any sort of insights around much smaller, startups or, that's my question.
It's a great question. And that was certainly a trigger for me when I went out on my own too. I have my own consulting business right now. And I think there's some pressure that we put on ourselves, especially those of us who are high achievers, to go it alone. There's almost a feeling sometimes that we're cheating if we ask for help or if we seek out other resources. And that may not be the case necessarily at a conscious level, but I've talked to plenty of people who feel like, well, I should really figure this out on my own first. But why, right? There's so many people who have come before us who have answered the questions that we're trying to answer, who have figured out how to solve the problems that we're trying to solve. And if for no other reason can provide a sense of you're not alone, right? You're in a very normal, very understandable place. And so I think it's really important to leverage the resources around you, whether it's getting involved in networking groups of like-minded people, whether it's reaching out to people who complement what you're trying to do. I understand that there's a certain level of probably discretion or confidentiality that you want to maintain when you're starting something new. But to the extent that there are more general questions or issues that you're comfortable sharing, there's no reason to do this on your own. Dude, somebody else have
that's great. Thank you.
Sure.
I had my hand up, but then I lowered it.
Oh, did you want to say something? Or...
I was jumping out on a limb. The sentence you said, where you're in a meeting and you want to ask the question and you don't, and then you feel, and I usually will chastise myself in that moment and ask the question. And so right here, I question, why am I here? Because I have graduated. I've been out of school since '92. I went back to school in my late 30s. And so basically some would say I've already lived that life, but I'm still trying to understand where it all went wrong. And this really speaks to me. And so attending this helps me to give it to my grandchildren even, or whoever. But I still am trying to do things. So, but Imposter Syndrome is the perfect title for me.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Parmi. And I'm sorry that it's been a challenging road for you, but I am glad that this is resonating. And I do believe truly what you're saying too, is that it's not just helpful for us as individuals, but to be able to pass this along to others who may be able to access the information sooner than we could.
Exactly. I've had lots of successes and opportunities, but today I'm living regret, missed opportunities. And so I'm hoping that this just gives me information so that I can even bring peace to me.
Oh, yes, I hope so too. Thank you very much for doing that. Are there any other questions in the chat, Michelle?
No, just resonating with the idea of being an introvert amongst extroverts was one of the comments.
Okay, yes.
It could probably go the other way too.
Yeah, anytime you feel different, and I think we as humans have a fundamental need to belong. It's just one of those evolutionary traits that we've adapted as a self-protection mechanism, right? So it wouldn't have been safe for us to not be part of our pack. And so we have a tendency to compare ourselves to other people, and we always notice the ways in which we're different. And part of that, I'll go back here for a second. I'm going ahead of I'm trying to figure out how to, sorry, let me go back. That, part of that is an adaptive behavior that we're on the lookout for potential threats, right? Ways in which we may not be as tightly linked to our groups as we could be. But we, in the process, often lose sight of what makes us special, of the very real complementary value that we have to bring to a particular team, a particular group that we belong to. And so in the quest for conformity, we often view being different as a weakness, as opposed to thinking, for example, everyone on this team is an extrovert. What can I uniquely bring as an introvert that may be missing when everyone else is exactly the same? And this is something that we talk about when we talk about the value of diversity and inclusion. We talk about diversity of thought, but it's a journey that we all have to take individually as well to be able to recognize our own strengths and ways in which we, what makes us different is an asset and not a deficit. So moving on, I want to share some specific strategies, as I mentioned before. And one of the strategies is to really recognize that imposter syndrome is disruptive thinking. And what helped me to come to terms with imposter syndrome in many ways is to recognize it as a fear-based, self-protective response. So what I mean by that is I mentioned that we're all hardwired to protect ourselves. And when we perceive something to be a threat, it triggers us, and it triggers that fight or flight response. And when we are triggered in that way, right, all of our resources become reallocated to just keep us alive. Our brains do not do a good job of discriminating between the threat of a tiger and the threat of humiliation or failure. So we have the same physiological response. And when we go into that response, we lose the ability to reason. We get shut off from the cognitive, more evolved center of our brain. And I am not a neuroscientist. I am just speaking in very simplistic terms, but this is what has helped me, is to recognize, that's just what's going to happen. It's when I feel myself threatened, when I find myself in an uncomfortable conversation, I can expect to experience a fight or flight response. Personally, I will share with you very candidly that I'm also a very high anxiety person by nature. I'm just wired that way. So I'm prone to catastrophizing. I'm prone to assume the worst. And so if I allow myself to stay in that place, I know that I can't problem solve. I know that I can't climb out of it until I start to think about it from a more cognitive place. And so what I like to do when I find myself in a situation where I'm questioning, do I belong here? Do I have what it takes to be successful here? Is to shift from a place of anxiety and all of this sort of amorphous energy that's difficult to channel, and instead go to a more analytical place and ask myself the question of, okay, what would help me to feel more confident right now? What would help me to feel more in control of this situation? Maybe I feel like I just want a little bit more information about this product before I step into this meeting. Maybe I want to take an online training in a particular area before I join this team, right? These are all actionable steps that you can take that once again make you feel more in control of the situation, as opposed to the more, emotion-based, anxiety-based ideas of, I just can't do this, right? I'm not ready. You can't do anything with that sense of I'm not ready. But if I translate that into what specifically would help me to feel ready, then that becomes the roadmap for how I move forward. So just notice when that voice kicks in that says, you can't do this, you're a fraud, you're going to be found out, to recognize it for what it is, which is a fear response. It's your brain telling you, run. This is not a safe place to be. It wants you to stay in that comfort zone. What I've learned from my own experience is to really see it as an overactive bodyguard, and to say, as cheesy as it sounds, right? Thank you. I appreciate that you're trying to keep me safe, but I don't need you right now. So that's a tip that can be helpful. I mentioned earlier too, the idea of really thinking about how this experience is similar to past experiences as opposed to different. I was talking recently with a client of mine who was explaining to me how one of the ways in which he maintains his confidence when he steps into new situations is to deliberately try to find the parallels between this new situation and ones he's experienced in the past, because when we are doing something new, as I mentioned earlier, what's new is actually very incremental. Usually we have found ourselves in some type of a similar situation in the past. And if we can pull from that and remind ourselves, I've been here before, I have the tools, I have the resources, I have the capabilities. It's just a little bit different this time around. It keeps things in perspective and allows us to get a little bit more of a sense of control and better ability to manage those feelings. It's also really important to own our own success, which tends to be challenging for many of us, oftentimes women, and often people who have grown up in cultures that really value humility. So we may have been taught at an early age not to brag, right? It's not polite to brag. We have adapted in such a way to not necessarily think of ourselves proactively in strengths-based ways. And like I said, when you couple that with the natural tendency to always be on the lookout for the potential threats, we're naturally going to zoom into all the things that we don't do well, as opposed to the things that we do well. And my philosophy on this is that it's all well and good to know what you need to develop. We don't want to stop growing and challenging ourselves. We should always be taking that next step forward. But at the same time, we owe it to ourselves to balance that self-awareness with an unapologetic acceptance of the fact that we already have strengths, or we wouldn't be where we are today. Not one of you would be on this call right now if you did not have strengths, if you did not have value to contribute. And so we have an opportunity to get more connected to what that looks like. And one of the ways that I recommend doing this is to adopt a practice of tracking your accomplishments. At the end of every day or the end of every week, do not go more than a week, you will not remember, but it's to just create a habit of writing down all of the things that you've accomplished during that time period. Problems you've solved, things that you're celebrating, things you crossed off the list. Don't have to be monumental, right? But just write them all down. And it has this incredibly powerful effect. First of all, incidentally, it's a great tool for doing performance reviews, for updating your resume, trying to recreate all of that information at 1 year, 6 month intervals makes it really hard to remember. If you've got all of this at your fingertips, it's going to be so much easier. But from a confidence perspective too, what's really helpful about it is that often we think we're here because of a fluke, right? I cheated in some way. I got in through a connection, or they didn't realize that I don't actually know what I'm doing. When you keep a log of all of the work that you're doing and you start to look back at it, you can't chalk that up to luck, right? You're going to start to realize, because it's in an objective format, wow, I'm doing a lot more than I thought I was, right? Like, actually, I am adding value. So it's a great confidence boost when you are experiencing those dips and, it's imposter syndrome like feelings. What's also really nice about it is that it's similar in practice to a gratitude journal. So when you keep a gratitude journal and you're always writing down what you're grateful for, you're literally training your brain to look for the positive instead of the negative. Well, if you're writing down every day all the things you're doing well, you're training your brain to look at yourself through a strengths-based lens as opposed to a weakness-based lens. So it's a practice that you can adopt at any time. You can start today, and I think you're going to find that it has a lot of great benefits to it. Leveraging your resources, I mentioned this to Bert. I want to share my own personal story with imposter syndrome, and this is one of the things that really helped me. I mentioned earlier that I went to work in the high-tech space, having been a psych major. I always saw myself as a psychologist. From the time I was a kid, that's all I ever wanted to do. I wanted to go into a PhD program, become a clinical psychologist. And my whole life up to a certain point was spent in preparation for that. But I reached a point in my early 20s when I thought to myself, you know what, I'm just not ready to go to grad school right now. I can't have that kind of lifestyle. So I decided, it was the peak of the dot-com boom. I had, a person in my network that worked in high tech, and I decided to go work for tech company. And I thought, well, one of two things is going to happen. It's either going to give me that extra push I need to go to grad school, or it's going to take me in a new direction. I was really pleasantly surprised that having a psych degree actually helped me in the business world. It's not something I had ever thought about, but I was really good at the soft skills. That part allowed me to excel pretty quickly. And I got promoted very early on to a role where I was often the only woman in the room, often the youngest by 15, 20 years, and the only person without technical experience. And I would sit in these meetings and think, oh my gosh, I'm one question away from my whole career ending. And it was paralyzing at times. I would just sit quietly and hope that no one would notice that I was there. And I started to have all of this anxiety and ask myself, what am I going to do with this? At one point, I thought, I'm just going to go back to school. I'm going to go get an engineering degree instead of a PhD in psychology, right? And I actually took 3 courses in engineering before I realized, I'm not sure this is right for me. But what I ultimately did is I reached out to the executive vice president, who at this point was probably 5 or 6 levels above me. And I sat down with him and I said, sometimes I feel in over my head in some of these technical conversations. Do you think I need an engineering degree to advance within this company? And he looked at me like I had 2 heads and he said, no. He said, you don't need to get an engineering degree. He said, you are surrounded by technical people. If you need a technical person, bring with you. He said, you don't need to know everything. You need to know what you don't know and build relationships with those people. And it was one of the most liberating conversations of my entire career, because when I walked out of that room, what it allowed me to realize was, hey, I never told anybody I was a technical person. It's not in my resume. I've never positioned myself that way. There must be another reason why I'm here. And I realized, you know what? There are things I can do that the engineers can't do. There are ways in which I'm adding value that the technical people are not. And from that day forward, it allowed me to shift my perspective to focus not on how I didn't measure up to the people who had skills that I didn't have, but to intentionally look for the ways in which I complement the group. So here's what I can do, here's what I can't do. And, in talking with that same client that I mentioned, who really looks for the parallels between the different situations, what he said to me that I thought was really interesting was, we spend so much time thinking about, just for example, Bob, the expert in engineering in the room, right? I walk in and Grecia, you said this too about like, I'm so aware of all the smart people, because most of us work with smart people. We work in the knowledge industry, there's smart, well-educated people all around us. And I sit in this room and I look at Bob and I think, oh my gosh, how could I ever compete with Bob? Bob's got 20 years of engineering experience. He's going to know all of this stuff. What can I bring? And what he told me is he often thinks about, what does Bob not know, right? And how can I fill that gap? And I thought that was such a brilliant way of thinking about it, because we are all brought into the room for a different reason. There is no reason for us to compete. If we all had the same background and expertise, it'd be a redundant use of our time. I'll share another quick example of this with a friend of mine who told me this story. About a year ago, she said she had a manager who wasn't a great communicator, and he pulled her aside and he said, look, I'm going to put you on this data analytics project. She leaves his office thinking, oh my God, what am I ever going to do on a data analytics project? I can barely use Excel. So she walks into the room, there's the data analytics people sitting there. She sits down and she says, well, clearly I'm the weakest link here. And they said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I don't know anything about data analytics. I have no idea how I'm going to be helpful in this project. And they looked at her and they said, well, that's why we're here. But what we need you for is to help us tell the story. We need you to provide us with the additional context. And immediately she took a deep breath and said, oh, that I can do, right? So I think we owe it to ourselves to, first of all, not get distracted by what we don't know, and to look instead for the people who already have that expertise, who enjoy doing it, who can partner with us on it. And second of all, to not assume that we don't have value to offer simply because someone else has a different kind of value. To really ask ourselves, okay, Bob's in the room for his engineering expertise. Why was I invited into this room? What am I here to offer? If I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, I have an opportunity to ask the question before I step into the room, right? Maybe I'll talk to my manager and talk to the meeting organizer and say, how can I best prepare for this meeting? what value would you like me to offer? How can I contribute? Right? And then I'll walk in confidently recognizing my place in the system. We're all one team and we share a set of skills and expertise. I have another client that I'm working with who she's part of a 3-person team. The other 2 people know Python and she does not. She has a dual master's degree from Harvard and MIT. She's a brilliant mind with all kinds of expertise, but she's kicking herself and saying, I don't know Python, so I don't even know why I'm on this team. Like, you've got Python covered, right? You've got 2 people on your team who know how to do that. You don't need to know it. You bring something different. So this is often where imposter syndrome kicks in, is when we're looking around and thinking, I don't have what that person brings. Stop doing it. It has changed my life. Finally, my final strategy for today that I want to share is something that I think is more of a organizational opportunity, or a way in which we can support each other, which is to really think about how inclusive and how psychologically safe our teams and our work environments are. So much of imposter syndrome comes from a sense of, I'm not safe here. I don't feel psychologically safe. We talked about the hesitation to speak up. I was having a string of meetings at one point with people who kept telling me over and over, I'm afraid to speak up because I don't want to look stupid. I'm afraid to speak up until I have a perfectly polished message. And I thought to myself, these are brilliant people who do not do this with their friends and family. They do not sit there and second guess everything they're going to say. There is something about this environment that's making them not trust themselves. And it comes down to psychological safety. So we can all play a part in creating psychological safety. We often think of it as something that needs to come from the top. And of course, that has an impact, and culture is really powerful. But in any meeting, we all have the power to create space for people who aren't being seen, aren't being heard. Maybe they're being interrupted. Maybe you can tell that there's something, there are wheels turning in their head and they're just a little bit nervous, to say, hey, Jane, you and I had this conversation before this meeting. You had a great idea. Would you be willing to share it? Right? To invite each other into the conversation and to create space for one another. That's going to make everybody's experience with imposter syndrome much more manageable. And once again, to the organizational piece, it's also going to allow companies to thrive, because they're going to get more from their people. They're going to get the creativity and innovation that they need to keep staying competitive and moving forward. So I definitely want to make sure that we have time for any remaining questions. And I also just want to share a free resource here in case you're interested. It's what I call an email challenge. So every day for 7 days, you'll get an email with some self-reflection questions and exercises to help you better understand your own personal experience with imposter syndrome and how to better manage it. You're welcome to use the link here to sign up, or you're also welcome to just reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to share it with you. I have my contact information on the next screen as well. I also invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I share a lot of content related to these themes from all kinds of influencers and people that I respect who share insights and strategies around these areas. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I would welcome the opportunity to connect or continue the conversation. So any questions?
Anything else? I'm curious, Kim, when you coach people, do you sometimes give some action challenges? Because I feel like action plays such a big part in seeing things.
That's a great question, Michelle. Yes, and I mentioned to you earlier that the idea of taking, well, let me take a step back. I mentioned that I'm a highly anxious person, right? And I'm also one of those high achievers that tends to want to find the definitive textbook for things that I don't know, right? I think that we often, those of us who are well educated, have this tendency to want to learn through textbooks or through trainings. And the reality is that we can't study our way into confidence. We can't study our way out of imposter syndrome. The only way to do it is to do the things that scare us. The only way to build those confidence muscles is to do the things that cause us to doubt ourselves. So a great challenge would be to really think about where are the places where imposter syndrome shows up for you. And I'm just going to continue to use the very popular example of I don't speak up in a meeting, right? And to set a goal for yourself. I'm going to say one thing in each meeting going forward, right? That's going to be my goal. You won't always achieve it. And there may, frankly, maybe times when it doesn't make sense for you to speak up, but that's the goal. And do it as quickly as possible. The more time you give yourself to talk yourself out of it, the less likely it's going to happen, right? Sometimes people will say, speak up early before all the good ideas are taken. The longer you wait, the more time you give your inner critic to say, no, that doesn't sound right. No, somebody already said that, or somebody, will think that that's foolish. So, just set a very quick and easy goal for yourself and do it as quickly as possible. Now, I often recommend too, when you're starting something new, don't dive into the deep end. Don't use your first practice opportunity in the middle of a board meeting, right? Do it with your team. Do it with people you feel some sense of connectedness to, and then you're going to feel stronger, and it's going to motivate you to do it the next time and the next time.
Yes, definitely. And we do have a question here. I'm the youngest person on my highly accomplished technical team by a few years. Do you have any advice for me to manage imposter syndrome and to manage expectations with my supervisor?
Yeah, so I think age is another one of those dimensions that can make us feel less than. And interestingly, I see this on both sides of the spectrum too, right? People who are younger, people who are older often feel a sense of self-doubt around their age. When you're early in your career, you bring a different perspective naturally, right? You may know things that the people who are older than you don't. Look for opportunities to help. Look for opportunities, and this might require a different type of observation than you're currently making. So let's just say you're really good at a particular kind of technology. Let's say you're really good at social media, something that the people on your team are not as comfortable with. Look for ways to use what comes naturally to you to support the team. It's going to allow you to build your confidence, because whenever we're helping other people, we're not focusing on what we don't know, right? We naturally build our confidence that way. And it also establishes credibility with the team. So if you're not sure, once again, I would just spend a little bit of time watching where they get stuck. Like, what are the questions that are being asked? Are they struggling to solve certain problems because they're using other, maybe perhaps outdated ways of thinking about it? And then if you're not sure if it's appropriate, or you're not sure the best way to position it, to talk with your manager about it, and to say very candidly what you're trying to do, right? I'd love to be helpful. As somebody who's young, I want to make sure that I am bringing my perspective to the conversation, and I want to talk with you about the best way to do that.
Great. Time for one last question. And I definitely encourage people to think about what are some takeaways, what are some things you're going to implement that you heard from Kim's presentation. There are a lot of good action ideas. We're getting one here, reflecting on the origins of my imposter syndrome and how it may have contributed to wanting to change careers right now. Absolutely. Well, Kim, I want to thank you for sharing these great ideas and your expertise in this area. I think you gave us a lot to think about, to self-assess, to work with our own, negative chatter inside, to look at our strengths. I think that's really powerful, to look at what we bring to the table, and that having that growth mindset. And thank all of you for joining us, for sharing your questions and your feedback and ideas during this session. Next month, we'll be having a session on understanding corporate culture. So I'll be sharing information with you about that. And my colleague Katie is posting our webinar survey in the email. If you can fill that out, we'll also be sending that along with the recording later today. So again, thank you all. Thank you, Kim. This is really important information, and think about supporting others too in this issue.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day, everyone.